Welcome, everyone, to this joyous occasion. We are gathered here today to celebrate the union of these two wonderful people.
I think you'll be more comfortable over there. The words, slick with a practiced, dismissive charm, slid out of Richard Vance's mouth and hung in the opulent air of the Versailles ballroom. He aimed them at Anthony, his new father-in-law, a man who stood like a solitary, weathered oak tree in a forest of glittering, superficial saplings. Anthony's suit was clean but dated, a plain, dark wool amidst a sea of bespoke tuxedos, and it marked him as an outsider. Richard's smile was a masterpiece of social cruelty, a perfectly sculpted expression designed to convey concern while delivering a killing blow. His mother, Eleanor, stood just behind his shoulder, her own smile a thin, venomous slash of approval. Her gaze raked over Anthony, cataloging his cheap shoes, his calloused hands, his utter lack of polish, and found him wanting. The target of their silent, brutal judgment was Lucy's father, and for Richard, that was a problem that needed to be moved, preferably out of sight. "There's a lovely table set up for the vendors in the garden," Richard continued, his voice a low, confidential murmur meant only for Anthony, yet loud enough for the nearby clusters of guests to catch the drift. "The orchestra, the caterers, you'll find your people there. More your speed, I imagine." Lucy, standing across the room, saw the exchange and her blood ran cold. The champagne glass in her hand felt heavy as lead. She saw the casual flick of Richard's hand, a gesture of dismissal, as if he were shooing away a stray dog. She saw the guests nearest them, the banking heir, the real estate mogul, their wives dripping in diamonds, turn their heads to hide their smirks. It was a public execution by 1,000 tiny cuts. Anthony's suffering was a quiet internal thing, but it was visible in the slight tightening of his jaw, the flicker of deep hurt in his eyes before he masked it with a lifetime of practiced stoicism. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the millionaire who was marrying his only daughter, the man who saw him as nothing more than an embarrassment to be managed, and held his ground. "I think I'll stay right here, son," Anthony said, his voice steady, devoid of the anger Richard both expected and craved. "The view is better." The quiet defiance was a slap in the face. Richard's smile faltered, a crack appearing in his perfect facade. This wasn't going according to plan. The old man was supposed to shuffle off, tail between his legs, cementing Richard's absolute control over this perfect, multi-million-dollar evening. Instead, he had created a scene. A small, tense bubble of silence expanded around them as the nearby guests waited to see what would happen next. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, urging her son to finish the job, to assert his dominance. But before Richard could escalate, the master of ceremonies, a man with a booming, theatrical voice, stepped to the grand stage at the front of the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I may have your attention, it is time for our celebratory toasts to the happy couple." Eleanor, seeing her cue, began to glide toward the stage, a predatory shark sensing blood in the water, ready to deliver a speech that would artfully praise her son and subtly erase any mention of Lucy's humble background. But she stopped dead in her tracks. Lucy was already moving, her face a mask of cold fury. She strode past her new mother-in-law, grabbed a secondary microphone from a nearby stand, and her voice, clear and sharp as shattered glass, cut through the expectant hush of the room. "With everyone's indulgence, and especially my mother-in-law's," Lucy said, her eyes locked on Richard, a silent declaration of war. "The first word tonight belongs to the man who gave me life, my father." The clock rewound 18 months. It didn't spin back to a whirlwind romance of moonlit walks and whispered confessions. It landed on a Tuesday afternoon in a sterile, glass-walled boardroom on the 58th floor of the Vance Capitol building. Richard Vance didn't fall in love. He executed acquisitions. He had acquired the contract for a new boutique hotel development, and Lucy Miller was the junior architect on the design team who had the audacity to challenge his vision. She wasn't supposed to be in that meeting, just a glorified draftswoman meant to take notes. Instead, when Richard outlined a plan for a cold steel and glass facade, she spoke up. Her voice was quiet but firm. She argued for reclaimed wood and warmer tones, for a design that felt like a home, not a vault. She presented data on guest emotional response and long-term brand loyalty tied to atmosphere. She was brilliant, logical, and completely unimpressed by his reputation. For Richard, a man who had clawed his way out of a cramped apartment in Queens, whose entire life was a monument to escaping the simple and the humble, her argument was an affront. But her beauty and her spine were assets. He saw her not as a partner, but as a project, a beautiful, unpolished gem he could cut and set to his own specifications. He pursued her with the same relentless focus he applied to a corporate takeover, overwhelming her with a world of private jets, Michelin star dinners, and front-row seats at Fashion Week. Lucy, who had spent her life valuing substance over style, was initially resistant, then intrigued, and finally captivated. She mistook his obsessive ambition for strength, his possessiveness for passion. The first crack in the fantasy appeared 6 months later, when he met her father. Anthony's home was a small, immaculately kept house in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood in Westchester, a world away from Richard's minimalist penthouse overlooking Central Park. The air inside smelled of sawdust and lemon oil. Bookshelves, heavy with worn paperbacks, lined the walls, and the sturdy coffee table between them was a piece Anthony had built himself, its surface smooth as silk under Richard's tentative touch. He hated it instantly. It represented everything he had fought to escape: modesty, contentment, a life built by hand instead of by leverage. Anthony greeted him with a firm handshake and a straightforward gaze. He was dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt, his hands clean but permanently marked by his work. He offered Richard a beer, not a vintage Bordeaux. He asked about Richard's work not with fawning admiration, but with the genuine curiosity of a craftsman trying to understand another man's trade. "So you move numbers around on a screen," Anthony had summarized, not unkindly. "I move wood around a workshop. Guess we both try to make something useful out of the raw material we're given." The comment was meant as a bridge between their two worlds, an offering of common ground. Richard heard it as an insult, a gross oversimplification of his financial genius, lumping him in with a common laborer. This was the moment his original sin was conceived. It wasn't a single act, but the beginning of a calculated campaign of erasure. The mission began with Lucy. He started by upgrading her. He hired a personal stylist who replaced her sensible, classic wardrobe with designer labels that were more uniform than statement. He coached her on the intricate genealogies of New York's old money families, drilling her on who was feuding with whom, whose foundation to donate to, and which charity galas were essential. "It's not about being someone you're not, darling," he'd say, his voice a soothing balm on her anxieties. "It's about learning the language. Once you speak it, you can say whatever you want." She was a quick study, eager to please, and a part of her was thrilled by the access and the glamour. She didn't realize she wasn't learning a new language. She was being forced to forget her native tongue. Next, Richard systematically distanced them from Anthony. Visits to Westchester became less frequent. He'd manufacture last-minute emergencies, fabricating board meetings or market crises that required his immediate attention. When a visit was unavoidable, he insisted they meet on his turf, a stuffy, overpriced restaurant in Manhattan where Anthony looked deeply uncomfortable, studying the menu like it was a complex legal document. The subtext was always clear: your world is small and provincial. Mine is the one that matters. The wedding planning was the apex of his strategy. It was a masterclass in social cruelty disguised as generosity. When Lucy announced their engagement, Anthony had taken them both aside, his eyes shining with genuine joy. "This is wonderful," he'd said. "Lucy, I've been saving for this day your whole life. I want to give you the wedding you've always dreamed of." Richard had cut him off with a perfectly timed, condescending laugh. "That's very generous of you, Anthony, really," he said, placing a proprietary hand on Lucy's shoulder. "But you shouldn't have to worry about a thing. I've got this covered. We're talking about a significant event, and it's my responsibility as her husband to provide that. You just focus on walking our girl down the aisle." He framed it as an act of largesse, but it was a power play, a way of financially castrating his future father-in-law. He was buying him out, reducing his role to a single symbolic gesture. From that moment on, Richard seized total control. He hired the most sought-after wedding planner in the city, a woman known for creating spectacles. Every decision was made to maximize status. The venue, the guest list, the 10-tier cake. It was all about broadcasting Richard Vance's arrival at the pinnacle of society. When Lucy tearfully confessed to him one night that she felt like a guest at her own wedding, and that all she wanted was for her father to feel included, perhaps by giving a short speech, Richard's response was swift and surgical. "Sweetheart, you're emotional. That's understandable," he said, stroking her hair. "But think about it from his perspective. You want him to get up on a stage in front of senators and billionaires and talk about his woodworking? It would be humiliating for him. He wouldn't know what to say. We'd be putting him in an impossible position. My mother will speak. My best man will speak. It's cleaner that way. Trust me, I'm protecting him. And Lucy, exhausted and conflicted, allowed herself to believe it. She became a willing accomplice in the slow, systematic diminishing of her own father, all for the sake of a man who was building their future on a foundation of shame. The silence that followed Lucy's declaration was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered the clinking of glasses and the soft murmur of the orchestra. For a full 10 seconds, the 200 most powerful people in New York held a collective breath. Richard Vance stood frozen, not by shock, but by a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated rage. It was a hostile takeover, a mutiny at his own coronation. His eyes, cold and hard as granite, locked onto Lucy, but she refused to look at him. Her entire being was focused on her father, a silent sentinel guarding his passage to the stage. Anthony himself seemed to move in slow motion, each step a deliberate, measured beat in the suffocating silence. He wasn't stooped or hesitant. He walked with the quiet, unassuming confidence of a man who knows his own worth, a worth not measured in stock portfolios or headlines in the Wall Street Journal. The guests, recovering from the initial stun, began to whisper. It was a low, sibilant sound, the rustle of silk and condescension. They looked from the simple man in the cheap suit to the furious millionaire groom and his defiant bride, and they smelled blood in the water. This was better than theater. Eleanor Vance materialized at her son's side, her presence as cold and sharp as an icicle. Her perfectly manicured hand rested on his arm, her nails digging slightly into the fine fabric of his tuxedo. "This is a calculated humiliation, Richard," she whispered, her voice a venomous hiss meant only for him. "That little tramp and her peasant father planned this. He's a nobody, an opportunist trying to make a scene to embarrass us. Look at them. They're laughing at you. At us. You are Richard Vance. You will not be upstaged by your hired help. Cut his microphone. Have security escort him out. Do it now, before he turns this wedding into a circus." Her words were the gasoline on the fire of his rage. She gave his fury a target and a justification. It wasn't just an embarrassment, it was an attack. He, who had orchestrated every detail of this night to project an image of absolute power, was being made a fool of by an old man in a polyester suit. He scanned the room, his eyes finding the event coordinator, a slick man named Julian. Richard gave a sharp, almost imperceptible jerk of his head toward the stage, then drew a finger across his throat. The message was clear: kill the sound. Julian, however, was looking at Lucy, who now held the microphone stand in a white-knuckled grip, daring anyone to approach. He was paid handsomely by Richard, but he wasn't stupid. He saw the look on the bride's face and made a swift political calculation, deciding that inaction was the safest course. He gave Richard a helpless shrug. Foiled, Richard took a step forward, intending to personally intervene, to take the microphone himself, to end this farce. But Lucy moved to block his path. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Her eyes, which minutes before had been filled with love and hope, were now glacial pools of contempt. They issued a silent ultimatum. If you touch him, you lose me. The standoff lasted only a moment, but in that space, the chasm between them grew into an unbridgeable canyon. Richard saw not the woman he was molding, but a stranger, a fierce, protective daughter whose loyalty was not to him. All this time, Anthony kept walking. He saw it all. He saw his son-in-law's frantic signal to the staff. He saw the whispered venom of Eleanor. He saw the raw conflict on his daughter's face as she shielded him, and the hurt inside him, the initial sting of being sent to the staff table, deepened into a profound and heavy sorrow. The disrespect wasn't a careless slight. It was a fundamental part of Richard's character. He had hoped, for Lucy's sake, that he was wrong about the man. Now he knew he wasn't. The knowledge settled in his gut like a cold stone, solidifying his resolve. He wasn't just giving a speech anymore. He was conducting a rescue mission. He finally reached the gleaming marble podium. It felt foreign and cold beneath his calloused hands. He adjusted the microphone, and the slight tap and squeal of feedback echoed through the ballroom, a sound that made every guest flinch. Richard felt a new sensation creeping up his spine, winding its way through his rage, a cold tendril of dread. For the first time that night, for the first time in years, he was not in control. He had no idea what was about to happen. Anthony looked out over the sea of hostile, curious faces, his gaze sweeping past the smirking socialites and the glowering tycoons, finally resting on his daughter. He gave her a small, reassuring nod, and then he leaned into the microphone to speak. "Good evening, everyone. Anthony began, his voice not booming but carrying a surprising weight that commanded attention, cutting through the whispers like a ship's bow through water. It was calm, measured, the voice of a man who had no need to shout to be heard. They say you shouldn't judge a book by its cover. It's wise advice. His eyes, clear and direct, swept across the opulent room, taking in the cascading orchids and the glittering chandeliers. He wasn't intimidated by the splendor. He assessed it, as a craftsman assesses a piece of furniture. This is a magnificent place, a true palace, a party that must have cost a fortune. He paused, and in that small gap of silence, the tension in the room coiled tighter. His gaze landed with unnerving precision, directly on Richard. A fortune that I know you've worked hard to build, Richard, but success sometimes can blind us to what truly has value. Richard felt a surge of hot, indignant blood rush to his face. A lecture? He was getting a public lecture on values from a man who probably clipped coupons? He shot a look at his mother, Eleanor, whose face was a mask of aristocratic outrage. This was it, the pathetic ramblings of a bitter old man, jealous of a success he could never comprehend. Richard braced himself for a tirade about the evils of money, a cliché-ridden speech that would only serve to prove his initial judgment correct. He almost pitied the man for the fool he was about to make of himself, but what came next was not a sermon. It was a demolition. Anthony reached into the inside pocket of his simple, dark suit jacket and pulled out a worn leather document holder. It was a plain, functional object, a stark contrast to the everything gold-plated ethos of the room. With methodical, almost frustratingly calm movements, he unzipped it. "I've always wanted the best for my daughter," he said, his voice remaining even, almost conversational. "And when she told me she was getting married, I wanted to give her the wedding she deserved." From the holder, he slid out the first document. He held it up for a moment before placing it flat on the podium, smoothing it with his hand. "Here is the rental contract for the Versailles Ballroom, the St. Regis Hotel, duly signed and settled in full." A confused murmur rippled through the audience. "Paid for, that is. In my name." Richard's brain failed to process the words for a second. He blinked, a flicker of cognitive dissonance. It was a joke. It had to be a joke, a pathetic attempt at one-upmanship. He'd signed that contract himself, his signature a bold, authoritative slash of ink. He'd wired the 7-figure deposit. He knew, because he'd reveled in the sheer power of being able to do so without a second thought. Anthony was already pulling out the second document. "Here," he said, placing it next to the first, "is the invoice for the catering, a delightful menu curated by Chef Daniel Boulud's team, also paid." He didn't need to specify by whom. The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Richard could feel the eyes of the guests turning towards him, their smirks fading, replaced by looks of genuine confusion. He felt a prickle of sweat on his brow. Eleanor had gone rigid beside him, her hand gripping his arm so tightly he could feel her nails through the fabric of his jacket. "The contract for the New York Philharmonic Ensemble," Anthony continued, his rhythm unchanging as he produced a third sheet of paper. "Paid." Another document landed on the growing pile. "The floral arrangements, all 10,000 orchids, paid." And another. "The open bar, featuring a 1998 Krug Clos d'Ambonnet for the head table, a personal favorite, paid." With each word, each crisp sheet of paper laid bare on the podium, a piece of Richard's world chipped away. The foundation of his identity, his wealth, his power, his absolute control, was being systematically dismantled in front of his peers. The narrative he had so carefully constructed of the self-made titan bestowing a fairy tale wedding upon a girl from a humble background was being exposed as a lie. But the worst was yet to come. "And this," Anthony said, his voice softening for the first time as he pulled out a smaller velvet-lined receipt. "The tiara of diamonds and sapphires that my beautiful daughter is wearing tonight. A wedding gift. From her father." All eyes went to Lucy. She stood, tears streaming silently down her face, her hand instinctively going to the glittering jewels in her hair. The tiara wasn't a loaner from a jeweler for publicity. It wasn't a Vance family heirloom. It was a gift from the man Richard had tried to send to the staff table. The seed of doubt planted by the first document now erupted in Richard's mind into a thorny vine of pure dread. This was impossible. It was a bluff, an elaborate, insane bluff. A man like Anthony couldn't afford the valet parking at this hotel, let alone the whole event. His mind raced, searching for a logical explanation. Had he been embezzling? Was this blackmail? But the calmness in Anthony's demeanor, the quiet authority with which he spoke, belied any such desperation. And then came the final, killing blow. "You see?" Anthony said, looking up from the documents, his gaze sweeping over the stunned faces of the assembled elite. "My hobby, my passion is woodworking. I love the smell of cedar, the honesty of a dovetail joint. But my job, the work that pays the bills, it's a little different. My name is Anthony Miller." The name meant nothing to most, but to the handful of venture capitalists and tech investors in the room, it was a thunderclap. A few of them physically jolted. Richard felt the name hit him like a physical punch to the gut. Miller. He knew that name. He knew the legend. "And perhaps some of you," Anthony continued, his eyes finding Richard again, "especially those in the technology and private equity sectors, might know me as the anonymous founder and sole architect of a little software company I started in my garage, a company called Innovatech Solutions." The armor didn't just crack, it shattered. Innovatech Solutions wasn't a little company. It was a unicorn, a myth. It had been acquired 5 years ago in a landmark, multi-billion-dollar deal by a major conglomerate, and its founder, a notorious recluse known only as A. Miller, had vanished. His identity the biggest mystery in Silicon Valley. Richard's blood ran cold. He felt dizzy, the magnificent ballroom tilting on its axis. He had looked at a giant, a king in his own right, and had seen only a peasant, because the giant wasn't wearing a crown. He wasn't just arrogant. He was a fool. A blind, pathetic, ignorant fool. The world had dissolved into a roaring tunnel of white noise. Richard stood beside the stage, a statue of ash in a bespoke tuxedo, as the implications of Anthony Miller's final words settled over the ballroom like a nuclear winter. Innovatech Solutions. The name echoed in the silent, screaming cavern of his mind. It wasn't just a company. It was a legend, a specter that haunted Wall Street, a ghost that had made a handful of early investors obscenely wealthy before vanishing. And the man who built it, the mythical A. Miller, was the humble woodworker he had just tried to banish to the servants' quarters. The shame was a physical force, a crushing weight on his chest that stole the air from his lungs. He could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on him, not with pity, but with a kind of morbid schadenfreude-laced fascination. He was no longer Richard Vance, the Titan. He was the punchline to the most expensive joke ever told. He saw Anthony step down from the stage, not with a triumphant smirk, but with a look of profound, weary sadness. He saw Lucy rush to her father's side, their embrace a silent tableau of loyalty that excluded him completely. He had to get out. He turned and walked, his movements stiff and robotic, pushing past a stunned guest who stood in his way. He didn't head for the exit. That was too public. He went through a side door marked "Staff Only," plunging into the cool, fluorescent-lit labyrinth of the hotel's back corridors. The sudden change from opulent ballroom to sterile hallway was jarring. He could hear the clatter of dishes, the urgent calls of the kitchen staff. Here, in the engine room of the party, no one knew or cared who he was. He was just a man in a suit, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. He didn't stop walking until he found an empty office, the door unlocked. He stepped inside, shut the door, and leaned against it. The click of the latch, the first sound that had registered in minutes. He ripped off his bow tie, gasping for air like a drowning man. His first instinct was not remorse. It was a feral, cornered animal rage. It was a con, a trick, an elaborate, perfectly executed scheme to publicly humiliate him. Why? An old business rival? Someone he'd crushed on his way up? He didn't know, but he would find out. He would tear this old man's life apart, thread by thread, until he found the lie that would invalidate everything. His hands shaking, he pulled out his phone. He didn't call Lucy. He didn't call his mother. He called David Chen, his personal lawyer, a man who specialized in making problems disappear. "David," he barked, dispensing with pleasantries, "I need everything you can find on a man named Anthony Miller. Lives in Westchester. Poses as a woodworker. I need it yesterday." David, likely roused from sleep, was confused. "Richard, it's your wedding night. Is everything all right?" "Just do it," Richard snarled. "And I need you to get a team on this immediately. I want a full corporate trace on a wedding planning LLC called Elysian Events. I wired all the wedding funds through them. I want to know who owns it, who the principals are, and where every single dollar I sent them ended up. Spare no expense. I want answers by morning." He hung up before David could ask another question. He felt a sliver of control return. This was his world. Investigation, data, leverage. He would find the angle. He would expose the fraud. He paced the small office like a caged panther. He replayed the scene on the stage over and over. The documents, the calm, steady voice, the receipt from Tiffany's. It couldn't be real. He left the hotel through a service exit, avoiding the lobby, and took a taxi back to his empty penthouse. The place felt cold, alien. Lucy wouldn't be coming home tonight. He knew that, with a gut-wrenching certainty. He went straight to his home office, a room that was a carbon copy of his Wall Street command center, and fired up his Bloomberg terminal. He began his own investigation, diving into the archives, searching for any scrap of information on the Innovatech acquisition. The public details were sparse, just as he remembered. A landmark deal, an all-cash offer, and an anonymous founder who walked away with a figure estimated to be north of $3 billion. The acquiring firm had been forced to sign an ironclad NDA, and the identity of A. Miller had remained a closely guarded secret. It was a digital fortress. He spent hours fueled by a bottle of Macallan 25 he didn't remember opening, cross-referencing names of early investors, looking for any connection, however tenuous, to his own past deals. He found nothing. No shared contacts, no rivalries, no overlap. The man was a ghost. Around 4 a.m., his phone buzzed. It was a secure email from David's office. The subject line was a single word, preliminary. He opened it, his heart hammering against his ribs. The initial report on Anthony Miller was attached. Public records confirmed the Westchester address, a property owned outright for 30 years. No mortgage, no liens. The credit history was practically non-existent, save for a few small, regularly paid utility bills. He was, on paper, a man of no means and no ambition. But the second part of the report made Richard's blood turn to ice. David's forensic accounting team had hit the same digital fortress Richard had, but they had tools to probe its perimeter. The network of shell corporations and blind trusts protecting the Innovatech founder's identity was one of the most sophisticated they had ever encountered. It was a masterpiece of legal and financial misdirection, designed by a genius to make a man disappear completely. They couldn't breach it, not in a few hours. But they confirmed one critical detail. The meager digital breadcrumbs all led back to the same source. The beneficiary was, without a doubt, the architect of Innovatech. Richard stared at the screen, the words blurring. His theory of a long con, a vengeful rival, was evaporating. There was no rational explanation for a man of that stature to orchestrate such a bizarre personal attack. There was only one possibility left, the one his arrogant mind refused to accept, that it was all true, that the quiet man he'd despised, the man he'd deemed unworthy of sharing a room with him, was not just his equal, but his superior, in every way that mattered. The phone buzzed again. It was a text from Lucy, the first communication since the disaster. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a demand. It was a single, devastating sentence. "I'm at my dad's house, the one you never wanted to visit." Just as he was processing the blow, his secure line rang. It was David Chen. "We got in," David said, his voice strained with a mixture of exhaustion and awe. "We broke through the firewall on the Elysian Events LLC. It's a shell, all right, set up 3 months ago. Only one transaction in its history, receiving your funds, and only one transaction out, refunding them all minus the deposits back to an external account." Richard held his breath. "Who, David?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Who owns the account?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "The sole signatory, the man who received all your money and then paid for your wedding out of his own pocket," David said slowly, "is Anthony Miller." The click of the phone disconnecting was the loudest sound Richard had ever heard. It was the sound of a universe ending. He sat in the sterile silence of his home office, the skyline of New York a glittering, meaningless tapestry outside his window, and stared at the name on the screen, Anthony Miller. It wasn't just a name anymore. It was a judgment. The forensic accountant's report lay open on one monitor, a clinical, passionless dissection of his own humiliation. The text from Lucy glowed on another, a single sentence that had bulldozed the ruins of his marriage. And the final confirmation from his lawyer echoed in the room, the final nail in the coffin of his pride. It was all true. Every impossible, world-shattering detail. The money was real. The secret was real. The complete and utter fool in the mirror was real. His rage had burned out, leaving behind nothing but the cold, heavy ash of truth. For the first time, there was no one else to blame. There was no angle to play, no leverage to apply, no enemy to crush. The enemy was him. His mind, a machine built for cold calculation, began to connect dots it had previously refused to see. He saw his mother, not as a matriarch but as a poison, dripping her contempt for the common into his ear since childhood, shaping his values until status was the only currency he recognized. He saw his pursuit of Lucy, not as a romance, but as a hostile acquisition of a beautiful asset he intended to strip mine and polish for his own portfolio. He saw the wedding, his supposed masterpiece, for what it was, a vulgar monument to his own insecurity. Every orchid, every bottle of champagne, every hand shaken in that ballroom was a testament to a profound and pathetic emptiness. He had spent a lifetime accumulating weapons, wealth, power, influence, only to discover he had been waging a war against his own humanity. And he had lost. Decisively, he needed to move, to do something. Sitting in this sterile cage of his own making was a kind of death. A single phrase from Anthony's speech cut through the noise. My hobby, my passion, is woodworking. It was the only personal detail the man had offered, and it now seemed like the only piece of solid ground in a world that had turned to quicksand. Richard stood up, his movements still stiff, and walked out of the penthouse, leaving the lights on, the bottle of scotch open, the entire apparatus of his former life running on empty. He didn't take a car service. He went to the garage himself and got into his Aston Martin, the engine's roar a pathetic protest against the silence in his soul. He drove, not aimlessly, but with a terrifying magnetic pull towards one place. He drove to Westchester. The house was exactly as he remembered, small, unpretentious, infuriatingly content with its own existence. It was dark, save for a single soft light glowing from a detached garage at the back of the property. He parked down the street, the sleek, ostentatious car looking obscene in the quiet suburban neighborhood. He walked up the driveway, his expensive leather shoes crunching on the gravel. He didn't go to the front door. He was drawn to that light. The garage door was closed, but a wide, multi-paned window offered a clear view inside. He looked through the glass, his breath fogging a small patch of the cold pane. The scene within was one of profound peace. It was a craftsman's sanctuary. Tools hung in perfect order on the walls. The air, even from outside, seemed thick with the clean, honest smell of cut wood. And there, in the center of the room, stood Anthony Miller. He wasn't celebrating his victory. He wasn't on the phone with lawyers. He was at a workbench, a hand plane gliding smoothly over a long plank of dark cherry wood, his movements rhythmic, practiced, and utterly focused. He was creating, not conquering. But it wasn't Anthony that delivered the final devastating blow. It was what stood on another workbench, illuminated under the bright, clear light of a task lamp. It was a scale model of a building, a piece of architectural art so detailed, so exquisitely crafted from different species of wood, that it took Richard's breath away. He recognized the design instantly. It was the boutique hotel, the project that had brought him and Lucy together. But it wasn't his version. It wasn't the cold steel and glass monument to capital he had forced through. This model was different. It had the reclaimed timber facade Lucy had fought for. It had the warmer, more inviting lines she had sketched. It had a soul. It was her vision, not just preserved but perfected. Strewn on the bench next to the masterpiece were blueprints and drawings. He could see Lucy's familiar, elegant handwriting on them, but it was intertwined with another script, older, sharper, full of technical annotations on joinery, load-bearing walls, and the specific grain direction of the wood to be used. The revelation was not a thought, it was a physical impact, a punch to the gut that left him breathless. Anthony wasn't just her father. He was her teacher, her mentor, her silent partner. The brilliance he had first seen in Lucy, the fire and vision he had sought to possess, was not solely her own. It was a flame kindled and carefully tended by the very man he had dismissed as a simpleton. He had tried to sever Lucy from her roots, not understanding that the roots were the source of everything he claimed to admire. His entire courtship, his entire marriage, was based on a colossal, arrogant misreading of value. He hadn't just insulted a man. He had failed to recognize the true nature of the woman he claimed to love. He sank to his knees on the cold gravel of the driveway, the world completely and irrevocably shattered, finally understanding the true magnitude of his sin. The drive back to Manhattan was a blur of headlights and concrete canyons. Richard left the Aston Martin with the doorman like a man leaving a murder weapon, not even waiting for a ticket. He rode the private elevator up to his penthouse, the silence pressing in on him. When the doors opened, he was not surprised to see his mother, Eleanor, waiting for him. She sat on a white leather sofa, a glass of sherry in her hand, the picture of aristocratic fury. She had been rehearsing this speech. "There you are," she began, her voice brittle with contempt. "I have been calling for hours. Do you have any idea of the spectacle you allowed? The humiliation? That man, that Carpenter, made a mockery of the Vance name. I've already spoken to our lawyers. We'll have this marriage annulled first thing in the morning. We'll issue a statement about a momentary lapse in judgment due to the stress of the—" No, the word was quiet, but it had the finality of a closing vault. It stopped her mid-sentence. Richard didn't look at her. He walked to the vast floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked Central Park, the view he had once considered the symbol of his victory over the world. Now, it just looked like a million distant, lonely lights. "There will be no annulment," he said, his back still to her. "There will be no statements. There will be only one change." Eleanor stood up, her composure cracking. "What are you talking about? Have you lost your mind? That girl and her father conspired to destroy you?" "He didn't destroy me, Mother," Richard said, finally turning to face her. His eyes were hollowed out, stripped of all their former arrogance. They were the eyes of a man who had stared into an abyss and seen his own reflection. He just held up a mirror. "And I saw what you created." He walked over to his desk, pulled out a thick checkbook from a drawer, and took out a pen. "I have spent 42 years chasing the validation you taught me to crave. I've measured my worth in stock prices, in headlines, in the envy of other men. I've treated people as assets or liabilities. Tonight I tried to move a man to the service entrance because he didn't fit the aesthetic. A man who was worth 1,000 of me. A man who paid for the very floor you're standing on. That is sentimental nonsense," she spat. "He is new money, a vulgar trickster." "No," Richard said, scribbling furiously in the checkbook. "He is what I could have been if I hadn't had you as a mother." He tore the check out and slid it across the polished marble of the desk. It was made out to her. The amount was obscene, enough to sustain her lavish lifestyle for the rest of her life, but it was finite. "This is the last dollar you will ever receive from me," he stated, his voice devoid of all emotion. "The accounts are frozen as of this moment. Your name is being removed from the board of the foundation. The apartment downstairs, which is in my name, will be sold. You have 30 days to vacate. We are done." Eleanor stared at the check, then at him, her face a grotesque mask of disbelief and rage. "You would choose them? A common architect and a sawdust-covered peasant over your own mother?" "I am not choosing them," Richard said, his voice quiet but unshakable. "I am choosing me, the man I have to try and become, and that man cannot exist in the same world as you." He walked past her toward the door, leaving her standing alone in the vast empty monument to their shared bankrupt values. Her shriek of fury followed him into the hall, but for the first time in his life, it had no power over him. It was just noise. He didn't go back to Westchester that night. It would have been an intrusion, an act of selfish desperation. Instead, he checked into a nondescript hotel in Midtown under a false name, a place of beige walls and anonymous furniture. He didn't sleep. He sat in a chair by the window and waited for the dawn, letting the full weight of his actions settle over him. When the first gray light of morning broke over the city, he called his lawyer again. His instructions were precise, radical, and non-negotiable. An hour later, carrying a single, thick leather folio, he took a simple yellow cab to Westchester. He walked up the gravel driveway, this time in the full light of day, and knocked on the front door. Lucy answered. Her eyes were red-rimmed and wary. She wore a simple gray sweater that he recognized from the early days of their relationship, before he'd had it replaced by a stylist. She said nothing, just looked at him, her face a canvas of hurt and exhaustion. "Lucy," he began, his voice raw. There are no words. "Sorry is a pathetic insult for what I did. I can't ask you to forgive me. I haven't earned the right." He didn't try to touch her. He didn't force his way in. He stood on the doorstep, a supplicant. "I'm not here to ask for anything. I'm here to do something." Anthony appeared behind Lucy, his expression unreadable. He held a simple ceramic mug of coffee in his hand. "Let him in, Lucy," Anthony said quietly. Richard stepped into the small, warm living room that smelled of coffee and wood. He walked to the sturdy handmade coffee table and placed the leather folio upon it. He opened it, revealing a set of professionally bound documents. "This," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "is the deed to the downtown hotel property. It has been transferred out of Vance Capital's name and into a new LLC, effective this morning. The LLC is named Miller and Daughter Design." He slid the document forward. "It's yours, both of yours, free and clear of any and all liens." Lucy stared at the papers, her mind struggling to comprehend. Anthony's expression didn't change, but his eyes were fixed on Richard, watching, listening. "That's not all," Richard continued, pulling out a second document. "This is an irrevocable trust. I have endowed it with $200 million. Its sole mandate is to fund the complete construction of the hotel, according to the original design specifications you created, Lucy. The ones I rejected." He looked directly at her, his soul bared. "The ones your father helped you perfect. I saw the model in the workshop last night. It was a masterpiece. The world deserves to see it built." He pushed the second document forward. "The trust is managed by an independent third party. I have no control, I have no say. My name is not attached to the project in any way. It is a gift. No, not a gift. It's restitution." He finally looked at Anthony. "Sir, Anthony, I didn't just fail to see you. I failed to see my own wife. I tried to separate her from the very source of her strength and her brilliance. This is the only way I know to begin to repair the damage, to give her back the dream I tried to steal, and to give it to her with the partner she should have had all along." He stepped back from the table, his hands empty. The sacrifice was made. It was real, permanent, and complete. "I will not contest a divorce. I will agree to any terms. This is all I can do. The rest is up to you." Anthony did not extend a hand to lift Richard up. Not yet. He simply looked at the man who had shattered his daughter's heart. A man now offering the scattered pieces of his empire as a penance. He looked at the documents on his handmade coffee table, symbols of a wealth so vast it was almost meaningless. And then he looked at his daughter. Lucy hadn't moved. She was staring at Richard, and for the first time since the wedding her expression was not one of anger or hurt, but of a deep, soul-shaking confusion. The man she thought she knew had been a monster of arrogance. The man standing on her doorstep was a stranger, broken and contrite. "The paper changes nothing, Richard," Anthony said, his voice calm and even. "A man is not what he owns. He's what he builds, what he protects. You failed at both." Richard flinched but didn't argue. He simply nodded, accepting the judgment. "I know," he whispered. "This isn't to buy my way back. There is no price for what I broke. This is just cleaning up the mess I made. It's the only tool I have left." Lucy finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "What about your mother?" The question hung in the air. Richard's face hardened for a fraction of a second. "My mother and I have concluded our business relationship," he said, the cold corporate phrasing a chilling testament to the finality of that schism. "She is no longer a part of my life." There was no grand moment of forgiveness. There was no tearful reunion. Lucy took the documents from the table, her hands trembling slightly. "You should go, Richard," she said, not unkindly. "We need time." He nodded again, turned, and walked out the door without another word, leaving the folio, a $200 million apology, sitting on the table like an unexploded bomb. The consequences for Eleanor Vance were swift and brutal, a social death delivered with the silent, surgical precision of the world she worshipped. The story of the wedding became the cautionary tale of the season, whispered over cocktails at the Met and lunches at the Modern. But the narrative that solidified was not one of a clever father-in-law, but of Richard Vance's epic public implosion and his subsequent shocking disownment of his own mother. She was no longer the matriarch of a rising dynasty. She was the mother of a pariah, a social leper. The invitations stopped coming. The calls went unanswered. The check Richard had given her was a golden cage, allowing her a life of quiet, lonely luxury, a ghost haunting the designer boutiques of Madison Avenue, forever exiled from the world that had been her only source of identity. Richard, too, vanished. He sold the penthouse, the Aston Martin, the Hamptons estate. He liquidated the majority of his portfolio, pouring the funds into anonymous philanthropic trusts. He stripped his life down to the studs, a painful, systematic erasure of the man he had been. He didn't call Lucy. He didn't try to see her. He respected the space she'd demanded, a silence that was a constant, roaring reminder of his failure. 3 months after the wedding, he showed up at the workshop. He didn't knock on the door of the house. He just stood by the entrance to the garage, watching Anthony work. He came back the next day, and the day after that. For a week, he just stood there for an hour each afternoon, a silent, solitary vigil. On the 8th day, Anthony stopped his work, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked at Richard. "Are you going to stand there forever, or are you going to make yourself useful?" he asked, his tone gruff. "The floor needs sweeping." Richard didn't hesitate. He walked in, picked up a broom, and began to sweep the sawdust and wood shavings, his movements clumsy at first, then more certain. That was the beginning. Sweeping led to stacking lumber. Stacking led to learning how to properly sand a piece of wood, feeling the grain, understanding its direction and its strength. It was a humbling, monastic existence, a silent apprenticeship. Lucy would sometimes see him there from the house, a ghost in her father's workshop, his shoulders slowly losing their arrogant tension, his hands, once soft and accustomed to signing checks, slowly becoming calloused and capable. 1 year later, the steel skeleton of the Miller and Daughter Hotel reached for the Manhattan skyline, a bold, beautiful structure of warm wood and clean glass. It was a testament to a vision that had refused to die. On the top floor, amidst the noise of construction, Lucy stood with her father looking over a set of blueprints. She was radiant, her confidence restored, her authority unquestioned. A man walked over, his face smudged with dirt, a tool belt around his waist. He pointed to a detail on the blueprint. "If we use a mortise and tenon joint here," Richard said, his voice quiet and focused, "we can carry the line of the support beam all the way through, make it a design element instead of just a structural one." Anthony studied the plans, then looked at Richard and gave a short, sharp nod of approval. "Good idea. Make it so." The exchange was simple, professional, the easy rapport of two craftsmen who spoke the same language. Later that day, they drove back to Westchester, not in a luxury sedan, but in Anthony's old pickup truck. Richard and Lucy now lived in a small, renovated cottage a few blocks from her father's house. It was a home they were building together, piece by piece. The dinner table they ate on was the first thing Richard had built that Anthony deemed good enough. The shelves holding their books, he had built next. His new life was measured not in acquisitions, but in creations. That night, as they sat in the quiet living room, Lucy placed a hand on her gently swelling stomach. Richard looked at her, his eyes filled with a quiet, profound gratitude he now knew how to feel. He had lost a kingdom of glass and steel, a world of empty symbols and hollow victories. In its place, he had slowly, painfully, and with his own 2 hands, helped build something real. He had finally learned to see the value in the grain of the wood, in the quiet strength of a good woman, and in the character of a man. It was a fortune that could never be counted, and a lesson taught in the most humiliating and liberating way imaginable by the father-in-law who had shown him the true meaning of wealth.